Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Never Turn Back, China and the Forbidden History of the 1980s, by Julian Gewirtz, narrated by Rick Adamson. Introduction. Forbidden History. On January 18, 2005, tucked away on page 4 of the official People's Daily, just below an article on post-tsunami inspections and above a weather report, a 3-line notice reported the death of an 85-year-old man. Comrade Zhao Ziyang suffered from long-term diseases of the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system, and had been hospitalized multiple times, and following the recent deterioration of his condition, he was unable to be rescued and died on January 17th in Beijing at the age of 85. A casual reader of the newspaper would certainly be forgiven for not noticing the item. The obituary was notable mainly for its brevity and omissions. It did not mention that Zhao had held China's top 2 leadership posts as Premier of the State Council and then as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Nor did it acknowledge that he had made any contributions to China's reform and opening, the agenda of economic development and openness to the world China pursued after the death of Mao Zedong. Reform and opening remained as a centerpiece of official policy, mentioned nearly a dozen times in that day's newspaper. But Zhao's central role in shaping it had already been systematically erased from official accounts of the history of this period. Indeed, well before Zhao's death, the CCP had rewritten the entire history of China's 1980s, a tumultuous transformational decade, and subjected it to far-reaching distortion, even though it was one of the most consequential periods in the country's history. In popular accounts around the world, as well as in the official narrative told by China's rulers, the 1980s in China are typically treated as a time of linear change, moving smoothly from Deng Xiaoping's rise to power in 1978 and the leap into reform and opening to new heights of wealth and modernization. In this telling, the decade whizzes by. The crackdown on the 1989 Tiananmen protests is at most a harsh interruption before the linear narrative begins again in 1992, with Deng pushing for faster reform on his southern tour. This story is a myth. It exists in large part because the CCP has suppressed sources and created a powerful and widely repeated official narrative about China in the 1980s that erases key figures, blots out policies and debates, covers up acts of violence, and forbids public discussion of alternative paths. In contrast to that narrative, the 1980s in China were a period of extraordinary open-ended debate, contestation, and imagination. Chinese elites argued fiercely about the future, and official ideology, economic policy, technological transformation, and political reforms all expanded in bold new directions. These years of tumult, searching, and struggle transformed China, but by the time protesters filled Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989, the leadership had not reached agreement on how China ought to modernize. Following the crackdown, which included both the massacre of civilians and the purge of top officials, a new consensus emerged, and China's remaining leaders offered a newly consolidated vision of the Chinese system, as well as a refashioning of the events of the 1980s designed to serve this post-Tiananmen agenda. Among many other changes, they built up the cult of Deng Xiaoping while erasing Zhao Ziyang and fellow top leader Hu Yaobang, reinterpreted the pursuit of rapid economic growth, and argued for the absolute necessity of fusing the party and the state. They abandoned, or left unfinished, many of the political reforms pursued during the 1980s. Before even replacing the tank-scarred stones of Tiananmen Square, they had pushed out their new narrative and staked the party's fortunes on it. What is today called the China model, extraordinarily rapid economic growth paired with enduring authoritarian political control, was not the only vision of the future China's leaders pursued in the decades following Mao Zedong's death in 1976. They imagined and experimented with many possible China models in the 1980s. Yet China's rulers have worked hard to conceal this fuller story and the pivotal choices that determined China's development. Bringing this forbidden history back into focus is vital. One of the most momentous transformations of the 20th century has been the subject of immense historical distortion to bolster the legitimacy of the Communist Party's chosen path. The fundamental question of the 1980s was one that had motivated Chinese officials and intellectuals for a century. How can China become modern? Deng Xiaoping declared in January 1980 that modernization was the essential condition for solving both our domestic and our external problems, and the 1980s would be a decade of great importance, indeed a crucial decade, to China's development. For Chinese officials and intellectuals, the challenge was to find a Chinese path to modernization that did not copy or import wholesale a foreign conception of modernity. To be sure, some thinkers embraced the West with few reservations, praising Americanization and Westernization. But those views were unusual. The more important predicament was how to define modernization anew in China, drawing on ideas and innovations from around the world, but on Chinese terms. To Deng Xiaoping, economic development was the essential element of modernization, and to achieve this goal, he was willing to permit markets to multiply and international trade to expand. But becoming richer on its own was not enough. Deng and other senior officials devoted significant attention to other domains that constituted China's modernization, including official ideology, advanced technology for both economic and military purposes, and the political system. They projected confidence despite daunting challenges. On a hike up Luo Sanmei Hill in Guangdong Province in January 1984, Deng Xiaoping was warned that the path ahead was steep and treacherous, and in a moment made for propaganda, Deng replied sportingly, "Never turn back." The line soon was widely publicized as a mantra for the leadership's resolve to forge ahead with reforms, no matter the difficulty, though it belied the fierce contestation raging over China's future. The Chinese leadership in the 1970s had embraced a set of objectives proposed by Zhou Enlai, known as the Four Modernizations, developing modern agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology, S&T. However, the Four Modernizations were only one piece of a much larger agenda. Dissidents called for democratization, which activist Wei Jingsheng called the Fifth Modernization, and others sought to modernize Marxism-Leninism for a new era of economic and technological transformation. Theoretician Su Xiaozhi said in 1986, "In China, we usually speak of the Four Modernizations, but in my opinion, this is not sufficient. In my view, modernization should be comprehensive, which means not only economic but also political and ideological." This book highlights both these debates about modernization and the CCP's repression of this history. After setting the scene at the dawning of the 1980s, it examines four realms of content.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?